So going into chapter 4, like I said, we're going to be talking about aligning and distributing objects on a page, stacking and layering objects, working with graphic frames, and working with text frames. There's going to be some specifics to all of those, but those are going to be the major points that we're going to cover in the chapter. Some of this might, again, be familiar for those of you that have some Illustrator experience or previous design experience. These are our chapter materials that I'm going to be using for some examples, because they're easier to use. So we use this one for working with aligning and distributing objects, this one for stacking and layer ordering, and then this one will play around with text and graphics, and I'll have a quick demo with some more text flow. Some basics that we may or may not know. I'll go through some of this quickly, hopefully not too quickly. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me and ask. So with basic objects, we may or may not know at this point, but to go over it, because the book does, when we talk about fills versus strokes, a fill is a color you apply that completely fills the object like this. A stroke would be essentially an outline of the object, color that you apply to the outline. There's, as with anything in the Adobe world, there's at least 3 different places you can change that, all doing the same thing. Here in your palette, it's pretty small to see, but you have your fill indicator and your stroke indicator, and it's showing that we do not have a fill, but we have a stroke. Same thing here, and then also in your color palette. Sometimes the color palette is easier to use. I find either the color palette personally or your menu options at the top a little bit easier. I find sometimes this to be a little bit small for the resolution of some of these giant screens. If you have a stroke applied like I just did previous, if you have a stroke applied or a color applied and you want to swap that, you can easily do so by just hitting that little arrow, that swap fill and stroke, and it literally does just that. Like, let's say we have, I'll apply. So you see when we swap that, now it just swaps the colors. That's all it does. So if you don't have a fill and you have a stroke, it'll swap exactly what your fill and your stroke is. To sort of reiterate, like if we have, again, if we have no stroke and a fill and you swap it, then we have no fill and a stroke. There's different options. I'll go a little bit bigger. Different options with strokes as there is with most tools. Some of the basic options show up here, like your stroke width and the stroke type. And then transparency and all your standard object effects here. But you have quite a few more options in your actual stroke palette. The different kind of caps you have, which is handy for, it shouldn't do anything. Yeah, shouldn't do anything because that will affect an open. Let's say we have, so basically I just deleted it, so these are open-ended. So you can see now we have a round cap versus a projecting cap. This makes a little bit more sense when there's actually a fill. There we go. A fill on the object, you can see that the color actually extends a little bit beyond the actual fill. To be honest, I don't think I can think of a time where I've actually used that, but it may come in handy. I use the round cap fairly frequently. It's more helpful with lines rather than shapes, but obviously it has to work with open-ended objects. Let me go back a little bit and close this up. Then you have the types of joins. So you can have a rounded join or a bevel join where it bevels your edge. The rounded joins, again, personally, I've used the rounded joins fairly frequently. They help when you want to sort of soften a stroke a little bit. Sometimes if you have a stroke on text or a more more odd shape, I guess. Sometimes you'll have your stroke gets a little crazy. Your corner points get like super extended. So sometimes rounding that point or rounding that joint helps a lot to sort of soften your strokes. You'll see as you're working, you'll see your stroke kind of get crazy, and you can use these options. This is one that I use really frequently. The align stroke, it comes in really handy. Let me just fill this again. So basically I'll zoom in. Basically what the align stroke does is, as a default, you can see here where we see our edges of our object. As a default, it aligns to center. So basically it applies the stroke from the center of the line out. And you can align that to the inside of the object. So basically your stroke will start from the outermost part of the object and go in, or vice versa. You can have it aligned to the outside. I'll use the align to outside very frequently. If I have if I want to apply a stroke to an object, what I'll tend to do is I'll have an object in front, and then I'll copy and paste it in back, and then I'll put the stroke on that one, just so the top one is unaffected. It's probably a little bit extra and unnecessary, but just my thing I do. But I'll frequently apply the stroke to the outside, so that basically it doesn't take away any of the actual space from the actual object. Like when you're doing, again, when you're applying a stroke, if you want to have a nice heavy stroke and you're applying it to the center, you see it kind of like eats away, I guess, your actual object. So when you apply it to the outside, you don't have to do it as heavy, and you still have the original space of your object. And again, you'll see you have your types. Oops, helps if I actually select it. Your stroke types, all that fun stuff. Start and ends is handy when you're using, to be honest, I don't use it too much, but start and end points. Let's see if it'll actually work. It's probably going to have to be open-ended. There we go. Wow, that's huge. So it has to be on an open-ended object, but it will basically say, like, you can have your start point be essentially a graphic, and your end, which clearly changes the shape of your object. You can have your start and end points. Again, another thing, personally, to be honest, I can't think of a time when I've actually used that, but it's not to say it wouldn't be handy. So you have these kind of options. You can also swap your start and end points if you want your start to be here and your end to be here. So lots of different options for color and stroke. I'll go back a little bit. Thanks. Okay. Let's remove that. And I'll back out a little bit. Color, again, pretty self-explanatory. Color is the color that you apply to the object. Again, you have some options with your color. You can also use your swatches to change colors. You can load swatches. There's a whole bunch of presets, but you can load. There it is. Works a little bit differently than Illustrator if you're used to loading swatch sets and object sets in Illustrator. But you can load swatches, create custom colors, etc. under your color options. Very similar to all of the Adobe suite. Stroke weight, I believe I mentioned it, but stroke weight is basically how heavy the stroke is. It's like when I had that giant stroke on one of the objects. That's stroke weight refers to the thickness or how heavy the stroke is. Aligning and distributing objects, again, some of you might be familiar with this, but We'll go over it. Aligning objects is fairly simple. We have a couple different options for it. I'm just dragging and selecting multiple objects. Once you select multiple objects, you get your align options in the menu bar. There's also an align palette, which I always have to say personally, I tend not to use too much, just because it pops up here, and that's pretty much most of the options in the align, or the options that you'll use on a frequent basis. Anyway, so if you want to align objects, you select the objects that you want to align, and then you have your various options: align left edges, centers, right edges, top, bottom, etc. So if you just hit, we aligned the vertical centers, it aligns all the objects, but it just kind of averages them out. So you'll see they kind of, not arbitrarily, but they average out between all the centers here. So let's say you want to keep this alignment to this object. When you select all the objects, you basically just click one more time, and you'll see you have that highlight. So that's going to indicate that you want to align to this object. So now, no matter what we do, I'll even do, let's grab the red one too, just to drive it. So now it's going to align to that yellow object. And you can switch to if you accidentally click on it and you want to deselect it, you just click it once, and this is without holding any modifier keys. Or if you want to change which one you want to align to, let's say we want to align to the red one, it'll just switch, and then you can align to there, and that will work with any of the align commands. We align that to the right. And that's essentially aligning objects. What you can do as well, what I tend to do a lot is when I copy and paste or am creating new objects, I'll hold Shift, and that option drag. So holding Shift will just keep it in alignment with the object that you're copying. So that way you don't accidentally like drag it down a little bit, and then it sort of saves you a step. Distributing objects is a little bit different, but sort of similar thing. We have our distribute options here. You can choose to, generally I usually either distribute horizontal or vertical centers. I tend not to distribute left or right edges. There's some exercises that will have you do it. There's reasons to do it, but in general, again, in my experience, I tend not to use it too much. But so basically, it's similar. You select all the objects you want to distribute, and then we distribute the horizontal centers. I usually hit the wrong one first, and I didn't in this case. So basically what it does is it pretty much will even out the space between all the objects. So it distributes those, as you see, distributes that space evenly among the objects. And you can do that with, they don't have to be the same shape. They can be different shapes. You could have, in this example we have squares, but you could have a square, rectangle, and triangles, whatever. But what it'll do is, this is where, kind of like kerning with text, this is where you might have to optically cheat a little bit, like it might be mathematically even, but if, like, let's say this one was a triangle and this one was a circle, because of the shapes, it's going to look like there's more space than there should be. Here, let's just go ahead and do it. I'm just going to make a shape here. We have a circle. And then I'll grab make a triangle. And I'm just using that eyedropper tool to make it the same. Oops. The same color. What I want to do is try to make it give or take about the same height. There we go. So let's say we have, I'll just create another square. So we have these different shaped objects. Oops. center them to that square first. We'll reselect and distribute. So now, mathematically, these are even. The guides are throwing it off a little bit, but mathematically these are even. But you can see, you know, again, sort of like kerning, if we zoom out a little bit, you can see like this space looks like it's a lot more. I should have put another square next to it, but this space especially looks like it's way more space than even here, but it's just because obviously the shape is different, so it gives you more space. So you might need to optically cheat a little bit here and there, again, kind of like kerning, and there's no sort of hard and fast rule. Just again, kind of with kerning, like that helps already a little bit. You can kind of back out and look at the negative space and you just kind of like even up the negative space. That would be the only drawback with with distributing objects when they're different shapes. You might have to adjust them a little bit because, again, what it does is it basically treats it like it's a square. So this is the same size. You know, this circle is the same size as a square, so it's treating the object as if the object ends completely here. So again, sort of similar to kerning. One of the other handy things that with distributing that InDesign does, let's go back to squares, you can live distribute. So it gets a little bit tricky. Again, sort of like when you're using the option shift commands to copy an object, it takes a little bit of timing. You can either let go of one of the keys by accident and have it not work. So there might be a little trial and error, but what they do is they have something called live distribute. So when you live distribute, you can actually change the distribution of the objects by moving the objects. Let's say we wanted to make, this group a little bit tighter, but we wanted to make sure that the spacing was still even, and instead of moving one object in and then selecting them and distributing, you can grab the resize handle, and by dragging in, holding the space bar, it will adjust just the spacing. It doesn't adjust the size of the object. So that's kind of handy. So if you had, again, if you had, let's say, more space than you thought, and you wanted this to be more even with this margin, let's say, give or take, you can hold spacebar and drag, and that will keep the objects the same size, but it will also adjust that distribution with the objects. That's a super handy thing. I'm not sure. I don't think that that's in Illustrator. At least I've never seen it come up. So the thing in Illustrator that does come up that sometimes works here, it's not going to work now. There we go. Is our smart guides. It does come up. I find them kind of funky. There we go. Kind of funky in InDesign. Sometimes they can be quirky, but that smart guide can help when it sort of knows. There you go. When it sort of knows that you're aligning objects, you get those arrows that pop up that will show you that those gaps are even. So that tends to help distribute objects. But that, again, that live distribute helps a lot. Again, just holding shift and grabbing the resize handle. Again, if you wanted to align these two objects and keep this distribution the same, it's super, super handy. Creating multiple object step and repeats are fairly simple in InDesign. One of the things I wish InDesign had, I know I feel like I pick on InDesign a lot in this class, but one of the things I wish InDesign had that Illustrator has is that Command D, which repeats whatever manipulation that you just did. Unfortunately, InDesign doesn't have that, but it does have a step and repeat, which is handy for creating multiple objects. So what you can do is, let's say, I'm going to make my copy, and then under Edit, I always want to go to Object first for some reason. You do a step and repeat, and now it's previewing it. It didn't actually do it. So you can select the amount of copies that you want to have. You can also choose the offsets that you want to have. So it'll offset at 2 inches. Let's say we do 0.5. So it'll sort of step it. It steps it from here. So you have to have a copy first. But I go back to 0 here, and then just hit return. And then if you wanted to create more of these, like a grid, you know, again, you can decrease or increase the count, and then now you have a nice handy grid. It's a lot easier sometimes than creating all these and then, you know, doing this. You know, again, this doesn't take a ton of time, but at least if you do the step and repeat, you know, with the smart guides it helps. These gaps they're pretty even, but with the step and repeat, you know that your gaps and your spacing is going to be exact each and every time when you step and repeat.
Is that step and repeat?
Yep, it's just under edit. So when you do a manipulation, it's under edit, right there.
Oh, okay.
And then again, you have your options. There's one of the exercises in the book walks through actually creating some offsets, creating sort of like checkerboard designs. But it's, you know, again, it's super handy. So this way now we know all of these gaps are exactly the same instead of hand doing it with smart guides. Smart guides and snapping to grids and guides, it's a little bit easier to do it manually, but it saves a couple steps when you do the step and repeat rather than doing it manually. Go back so it's not so obnoxious. And again, you can set those offsets. So if you wanted to have this nice even sort of stair step offset, you just set your vertical and horizontal offsets as you need to be. Sorry, I'm just looking through my notes and I went a little bit backwards. Live distribute I went over. The gap tool. The gap tool can be handy when I find it handier when working with text frames and adjusting text frames. With objects, personally, I don't find it as useful, but the gap tool is right here. It's this little, looks like arrows in between a gap. And basically, you'll see when you start moving around the artboard, like you'll see when you're on an object, it doesn't do anything because it needs to be in a gap. So it'll start highlighting what gap you're working with. It'll sort of find the gaps between these two objects. Basically, what it does is it allows you to adjust the gaps between the objects. The fortunate or unfortunate thing that it does is when you're using it without any modifier keys, what it does is, as you can see, it physically changes the size of the objects that you're adjusting. So it keeps the gap the same and adjusts the objects to that gap. When you hold down Option, it will keep. It's not as handy for these because we want these to be more even, but when you hold down Option, it will keep the shape of the object intact, and you can adjust between those. You can adjust the gap accordingly. Curious to see. No. So again, when you're not holding Option, it actually adjusts the size of the objects and keeps the gap the same. When you're holding Option rather, it just moves the objects. It moves the objects, keeping the gap the same, but you'll see it changes the gap on the other sides. And other modifiers, when you hold Command, it adjusts the gap from both sides, from both edges. In a similar way, when you're resizing a square, if you hold Shift and Command, it adjusts the object from the middle out instead of just one size. Again, I find it a little bit more handy if these were text frames. If you wanted to adjust adjust the size of a text frame here and have this frame be a little bit bigger. That one be a little bit smaller, etc. I find it a little bit handier there rather than with graphics. But that's a tool that we go over in Chapter 4. To be honest, personally, I don't use it too much, but you guys might find it handy. Moving on to another set of obnoxiously colored shapes. Stacking orders. Stacking, a lot of times people will use the term layering for everything as like sort of a catch-all, which can be confusing because layer ordering and stacking are totally different. Layering works, not to jump ahead of my notes, but layering works pretty much exactly how it does in Illustrator, similarly to how it works in Photoshop, whereas your stacking order is going to be the order the objects appear within a layer. So if you only have one layer, you'll see they appear here and they've labeled circle, the rectangle. So let's say we wanted, there's a couple different ways to do this. If you wanted this rectangle to be above the green circle but behind the blue circle, this is where it can get kind of tricky. I know a couple of us have played with this under object, so you can select the object and arrange, and you have all of your different options. So if we want this one to be above the green, what I would do is send it to the front so you know it's on top of everything, and then arrange and send it back one step. Oh. So what I find a lot easier, if you have a variety of different objects, a lot of times it's easier to use your layers palette to order stacking, whereas you'll see here when I sent it back one step, it sent it behind both of these. So what you can do is you can see we have a rectangle. If we open our layer palette, you'll see we have a rectangle selected, and then we have the two circles, and then we have the square. So if we want this ordered in between these two circles, you can literally drag and copy, or not copy, drag and rearrange, rather, that stacking order. And if you wanted the circles to be the opposite, let's say you want the green one to be on top, the blue one to be behind. I find this a lot handier when you have a lot of objects to actually grab and restack your objects. Again, if we wanted that square above that blue circle, etc. Basically, the layers, the order the objects appear on the page are how they appear in your layers palette, like a hierarchy. So whatever is on top in your layer is what's going to be physically on top on the page. So we have the square is on the bottom of this list, so it's behind everything. So sort of thinking about it on a plane that way, I don't know, at least it helps me make sense of it. Again, if you wanted to sort of go over that again, if we wanted this circle, so we selected it. This is where oftentimes naming, like since it's a shape, it's just going to call it circle, like naming it. This did this to me yesterday. You should be able to just click and rename. This did this to me yesterday too, that it's not letting me rename. There we go. You just have to click it just right. If you wanted to call it green circle and blue circle, so you have, when you have more in-depth illustrations or designs, a lot of times renaming your objects and renaming your layers helps a lot to easily find something. Again, since we had the two different circles, there's only two of them, so it was it was easy just to click one and see which one gets selected when you click it. But naming them, if you had like 10 different circles, naming them can help find them later if you want to adjust them. But again, if we wanted this green circle behind everything, let's say, you can just drag and drop and rearrange that order. Then there's also layer ordering. So we'll create a new layer. Whenever you create a new object, or within a layer or a new layer, it automatically creates it on top of everything else. So just to keep that in mind. So let's say we wanted, we'll create a new object here. There it is. And I'm just gonna, copy those two colors. And you'll see already there's an indicator with the layer. We have when you select the object, you have a red guide, I guess, or the resize handles and everything are red versus when you're selecting this one are blue, to indicate a visual indication that those are on two different layers. So since this is on a different layer that's above all of these, no matter what, they're going to be above everything else. And then if you have this layer positioned below, see if it'll actually let me do it. There we go. So now layer 2 is below. So everything on that layer is going to be below below the other objects in the previous layer. This is where layer ordering and stacking are very different. So when they talk about this with layering, it can get technically confusing. Again, since these are on completely different layers, they're going to be grouped somewhat together, and they're going to appear again similarly to how objects appear in this hierarchy. The layers do as well. You have different layer options as well, like if you didn't like this red for some reason, you can go to your layer options and you can rename it, rename your layer. You can show guides, hide guides, lock guides on a particular layer. You can change the color of that. Let's go with a peach. You can change the color of that layer indicator. It's a little bit light, but you can see here, it just kind of automatically, as you create layers, it just cycles through the colors. But if you wanted to assign specific colors to specific layers, for whatever reason, you can do that just by going into your layer options. Again, let's say we wanted, I don't know, sulfur apparently. Again, a little bit hard to see, it's a little bit light, but you can see the color change here. So you have, again, your layer options. Your layer ordering is very different than stacking, to reiterate. You can assign different objects to different layers if you wanted this layer or this object within this layer. Again, sort of like stacking, you can just drag and drop it into the next layer. But again, since layer 2 is below layer 1, it's going to throw this behind these three objects that are now left in layer 1. So you can easily, let's go back. You can easily stack between layers as well and move objects without having to copy and paste or physically move them on the drawing board. But you can change the order easily. A lot of times people will design, you'll have images on one layer, text on another layer, if you have any tints or objects on another layer. When you get into more in-depth illustrations and designs, you'll see a lot of times layering and really sort of being particular about your layers can help a lot. Sorry, again, just going through my notes. Graphic frames, so we'll move on to this one. Graphic frames is very low res. Let's move over a little little bit back out. So graphic frames versus what is placed within the graphic. So as we select this image, the graphic frame is going to be this overall shape that has the rounded edges. And if you want to move that, it moves the entire graphic frame and graphic. These are like the graphic frames are those frames that we set up on some of the templates that we did, things like that. These are just actually filled with objects. If you want to adjust the difference between, if you want to adjust the image or the graphics that are in the frame, what you need to do is click on the little circle, the target. I think the book even refers to it as a donut. You can select, we'll back out just a little so you can see. When you select by just clicking that circle, now you see we have the image selected and it shows you how big, like it shows you the bounding box of the full image, even though you can't see it. So this way now, since we have the image selected, you can move that up or down or even resize as we feel we need to. Like, let's say we wanted to get rid of that tree and make that a little bit bigger. That's the biggest difference between working with graphics and frames. And like essentially, a graphic frame is like working with like a clipping mask in Illustrator. And the big difference between working with a clipping mask in Illustrator is you need to use your direct select, and you can do it in InDesign, obviously. But using your direct select, you select the image, and then now you can move the image, which again you can in InDesign. It sort of saves you. It saves you a step by being able to just click that little target, donut, whatever they want to call it. It saves you a step from having to go to your direct select tool to just being able to click that little graphic. There we go. The little graphic in there to adjust your image without changing the changing the graphic frame at all. And again, you can use, when you select, you can also manually change, like we were previously. You can manually change your dimensions, the size of your image, the placement of your image, by keying it in. If you choose to key in the size, if you know you want this to be, say, instead of 11.5, you know you want that to be 11, and then it automatically locks the proportions. And you can move it over a little bit, again, just to get rid of that tree. So if you want it to be 11 by 8 and a little over a half, you can key in your dimensions there. And also with, if you do it with everything, let's make this height 4 just to show you. So now it made the height, it actually dropped it down a little bit, the graphic frame there. So you can select and key in if you know the exact sizes you want to, and you can control everything, most things in your graphic here, by using that. Move and resize, dynamic preview, and over. You can copy and paste graphics from one frame to another as well if you had like blank frames here. Let's do theoretically. Oops. Under edit, paste into the frame. That frame's a little bit different, but you'll see. There we go. And then you can adjust from there. The difference with just straight up pasting versus pasting into, you select the object, you select the frame rather, and you do an edit. Now it's not going to allow it because it's already there, but paste into or paste into place. and it'll keep it about the same shape. Oops, I went the wrong way. So you can copy and paste from frame to frame just by using the edit and paste into command. There's fitting commands depending on your needs. You can fit objects. You can fit objects within a frame. You can fit to the frame, so it'll automatically size it to the width or the height. There's different fit commands that you can use. Again, the content indicator is that donut-shaped circle at the center here. And you can click and select that. Then we'll work with, I'll go over some basic text flow, and then I'll set you guys free to work on the next assignments. We've touched on it a little bit, but working with text and graphic wrapping, you can see this text wraps around this object. It works somewhat similar to Word. It's just a little bit more responsive, I guess is the word. Bless you. It's a little bit more responsive than Word, but you'll see I selected the object, and you'll see that the wrap already indicates when you have text and any graphics together, it just kind of automatically recognizes this. Let's see. So we have now, it's basically pretty much ignoring the object is on top of the text, so you can see it sort of covers it up. So just sort of no text wrap around the bounding box, or wrapping around the edges. That's the wrapping around the edges is when is handy when it's like a circular object. We'll wrap around the edges of the circle rather than the full bounding box. Or this one, which I generally never use. The jumping an object is similar to when Word does it. I think it's when they do the text wrap, it treats it, for what the actual option is called, but it treats it like it's an actual, like it's on its own line, so it'll jump everything down the next line. To be honest, I tend not to use that one too much. It's pretty dynamic as well, so if you move the object within that, as long as you have that wrap indicated, it will adjust accordingly. You can also adjust, I find that sometimes you have to reset it, but you can also adjust this bounding box. So I'm gonna use my direct select tool, select my corners here. Oops. I'm just gonna arrow over a little bit. And the bounding box is, here, let's change that to no fill. That bounding box had a fill on it. Let's put a stroke on it lightly just so we can see. There we go. I find that sometimes you need to reapply that. There we go. So now this is where you'll see the difference between aligning it to the object. So now it's going to wrap to the actual image rather than the bounding box. Oops, it helps if I actually select the whole thing. So there, now it's going to wrap around the bounding box rather than the object that's within that box. So you can adjust your shapes accordingly, and it will, if you have it wrapped to the box rather than the object, it'll dynamically change as well. So text wrapping is fairly easy. It'll also wrap around more complex objects. There's an exercise in the book that goes over using more complex shapes. This is where InDesign works way better than any other design tool, really, than Illustrator, Word, etc. for actually wrapping text around objects. Lastly, working with text frames, which we've worked with a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to, hit the wrong button there. I'm just going to create a new document. There we go. I'm just going to create a couple quick columns here. So I know we've worked with placing text a little bit. I'm just going to resize that just a touch because I'm being particular. We've worked with placing text a little bit and text flow. When we have text that's too much text to fit in one space, it gives you that little overflow option. What you can do is you can also place text into multiple frames. Like let's say you have a document set up to where you have 6 text frames, in this case 3, and then you just want to place one article into all those 3 frames, so you don't have to worry about linking that text. It's working super slow. So again, you place it just like we did before, like we have worked with text before. You select the document that you want to place into, and we get our text placement icon. And then what you're going to do is you're going to hold Option when you click, and when you hold Option, you can see you still have the text indicator, and it's kind of hard to see. You'll see on your own computers. It's kind of hard to see in the right below the arrow. There's a little bent arrow, which is basically a continuation arrow. Oops, and I just messed it up. Oh, that's all the text that's in there. So now we've already linked the text. There we go. We've already linked the text between these two objects without having to do that little overflow and link. If you already know, the text size you want in there. Lastly, sort of creating column breaks can be super handy. Let's say, I'm just going to grab these, resize it a little bit so the text flows. So the text flow is a little bit easier to work with here. Let's say we had these two were a little bit longer, and we wanted this to jump to this column here and try to place that other text into this column. It's kind of like setting up page breaks and paragraph breaks within Word. Basically, you want to set your cursor to the spot where you want that column break, and then under Type, it's kind of buried. Insert break character, and then we can do, again, you can do a page break like you can in Word, but here we're going to do a column break since we're working with columns, and it automatically pushes the text to the next column that's linked. And since this is linked, it should work. Oops. Column break. There we go. And it'll push that to the next column. It's a little bit more. The placing the text technique is a little bit more advanced than what we've been using to link text between 2 columns. Again, it's not hard to reset that. But again, if you have a general idea and you have a layout, like when we build our templates, when we have our layouts already set up, it's nice and handy to have that option to be able to select multiple, to rather place text into multiple frames once you have your template set up. So those are the basics of what I wanted to show you, working with different types of frames, graphic frames, text frames, working with aligning and distributing objects. That's pretty much it. Are there any questions?